So today we're going to learn how to factor by grouping, and I have three examples that we're going to be using today. So a little bit more about how to factor by grouping. I'm going to move this down a little bit. So the goal here is to take 2, and here we'll just get started. We got enough examples so that you guys can try it at home. So right here we're going to group these two terms. And the goal is that once we factor out a term from here, and then we factor out a term from there, that we end up with something that they both have in common. So let's try out this first one. So right here we have an x squared. So I'm going to underline the groups. So we have one group here, then we have another group here. And I'm going to factor out the greatest common factor from the first two terms. So I see that this one has an x and an x, this one has a 3 and an x, so they both have an x in common, so I'm going to factor that out. So I put an x outside. Now what gets left inside is everything else. So right here we had two x's, we used one up, so one x gets left inside. So I'm going to write that down here. And over on the right side we had a 3 and an x, we took out an x, so we have a 3 left inside, a positive 3. Okay, so now we're looking for what can we factor out from a negative x and a negative 3. Well, right here we have an x, and right here we have a 3. So if you look at it first hand, it doesn't seem like they have something in common, but they do. There's actually like a negative 1 that they have in common. Negative 1 times x is negative x, and then negative 1 times 3 is negative 3. So they both have a negative 1 in common. So I'm going to factor that negative 1 out. So I have a negative 1. I'm going to put it outside, and what we get left inside is x, positive x, and a positive 3. So now I can see that these two terms, they have an x plus 3 in common. So I'm going to take this x plus 3 and factor it out. So you want to think about this as like, if you had like an x times y and the negative 1 times y, you can factor out a y from both of them. But right here, it's a binomial. We have x plus 3 and x plus 3, so we can take that entire thing and factor it out. So I'm going to put that x plus 3 in front of everything. So I have an x plus 3. And then, so I took out the x plus 3, so I have left inside an x and a negative 1. So I'm going to put that in parentheses, an x minus 1. So that's done. And you can check yourself to make sure that you did it correctly by foiling. So factoring is the opposite of multiplication, so we're going to multiply these out. So let's check. So I'm just going to put here, check. So I'm going to take x times, here I'm going to use my laser pointer, x times x, x times negative 1, 3 times x, and then 3 times negative 1. So that's first outside, inside last. That's foiling. So we get x squared, x times x, then x times negative 1 is negative x. 3 times x is positive 3x. And 3 times negative 1 is negative 3. So it looks like we have all of the terms that we started with. We have an x squared, we have a negative x, we have a positive 3x, and we also have a negative 3. So this is check. We ended up with what we started with. So check. That is factored correctly. So now let's look at this next problem. We have x cubed minus 6x squared plus 7x minus 42. We're going to again group these together. Sometimes you'll have to like move this number here and then move this number here so that they have a factor in common. So you just got to watch out for that. But I've organized them here where the first two terms have a factor in common and the second two terms have a factor in common. So right here I'm gonna, I have an x cubed and then I have a negative 6x squared. there's three x's here, so we can like break that down into x times x times x, and then over here we have two x's. So I'm going to factor out two of these x's. So x squared is factored out. And I don't have any other number except for 1 right here, so I can't factor any other number except for 1. So I'm going to, well, what do we have left inside? We have 1x left. We have a -6 and parentheses. So that's all. And you can always check yourself to make sure that that's correctly factored by distributing. So x squared times x, that's x cubed. And then x squared times -6 is -6x squared. All right, so now let's look at the second group. So right here we have 7x minus 42. It looks like they both have a factor of 7 in common. So 7 times 6 is 42. So this has a 7 and a 6 as a factor. So let's take that 7 out. It's a positive 7. Positive 7 times x is positive 7x, so that checks out. And then positive 7 times -6, that's going to be -42. That checks out. And it looks like now both of these terms have an x minus 6 in common, so we can factor by grouping. So again, we're going to do the same thing where we take this and then we factor it out. So I'm going to take that outside. So I'm going to write down x minus 6 because I just took that outside. And then we have left inside an x squared plus 7. You could also check yourself. So check to make sure that you started what you that you ended up with what you start. So now let's do that. So we got x times x squared. I'm foiling here. That's x cubed. -6 times x squared. That's -6x squared. Then we have x times positive 7. That's positive 7x. And then -6 times positive 7. That's -42. So that checks out. All right. So now let's look at the last problem here. So this has to be factored by grouping. Now this last one, it looks like we have a 3x cubed minus 2x squared minus 24x plus 16. The first two terms have an x squared in common, so I'm going to factor that out. And then I have a 3x left inside and a -2. So x squared times 3x is 3x cubed. That checks out. X squared times -2, that's -2x squared. Checks out as well. So now looking at the next two terms, it looks like, well, 6 times 4 is 24. And then 4 times 4 is 16. So it looks like they both have a 4 in common. Maybe they have something larger. Let's check out an 8. So we have 3 times 8. That's 24. And then 2 times 8. That's 16. So that's 8 is a larger, is the greatest common factor. So I'm going to factor out a -8. So let's see what we get left inside. So that's going to be a positive 3x. So -8 times 3x is going to be -24x. And -8 times positive -2. -2. -8 times -2 gives me a positive 16. And now they match. So if you ever get two binomials that don't match here, then either you did something wrong or you can't factor by grouping. One of the two. Most likely if they ask you to factor by grouping, you'll be able to factor by grouping. So now we're going to take out this 3x minus 2. We're going to factor it out from both of those. So let's do that. So I have 3x minus 2. We factored that out. And then we have x squared minus 8. And that checks out. So, well, let's check it to make sure that it does check out. But again, all we're doing is like we're going backwards. So 3x times x squared, that's 3x cubed. Then negative 2 times x squared, that's negative 2x squared. 3x times negative 8, that's negative 24x. And negative 2 times negative 8, that's positive 16. All right, so that's it.